these are some thoughts about Pluto Venus, because of course I'm at the airport to get my mind straight. Nervous system healing, going to the airport. So Ben Gurion did some good things in his life. Anyway, I was thinking about the Pluto Venus in general. So Pluto is about authentically facing your shadow, which is both your fears and passions and desires and like anything that's hiding underneath. You think about Pluto as the basement. I was, for example, just talking about the moon Uranus and Uranus Beta per se, and how Phonetically has something to do with the people. And today I'm on Facebook reading a family that a couple of houses next to them, there was a huge explosion in the basement and 42 houses were evacuated. And I'm like, oh. And so I am writing to my uncle about my predictions and bombing them with astrological delineation unusually on the spot, mentioning all the things that I know, including the fact that these basements were unfortunately very likely sexpionage bases, and it's not impossible that people were killed as well. And I was like, oh my God, that's an accurate prediction. So you think about Pluto, it's what's in the basement. And that was a good example. Sometimes it's like, I see that and it's like, okay, my family in Netherlands was a couple of houses from a huge explosion, 42 houses evacuated. And I'm like, I know what's in the basement, right? Because I'm an astrologer. And you think about, and I don't know if you'll even know about people that were, like, why would they tell us? I mean, it's espionage, right? So I said what I said. Pluto Aquarius is about hidden news. But that's exactly, it's what's in the basement, what's underground, what's buried in our psyche. And so Venus is about our value, knowing our value, our beauty, our clothes, our expression, our voice, connections, friendship, bringing things together. Pluto is decomposing. It's not about tearing things apart, like, let's say, Uranus or Mercury or, you know, or even Mars, which is severing ties. But it is about decomposing. It's about the compost. And Venus, it's about unionizing. Okay, you think of Uranus Venus as the union of workers, the union of people. Now, Uranus in itself is very global. It's kind of global movement and stuff like that. But in Venus sign, it's unions. It also a revolution in unions. But when you think about Pluto and Venus, you think about the part of bringing things together that has to do with decomposing. So you think about the compost, and Venus is flowers, for example. So you think about having a compost for your flowers is good combination of Pluto and Venus. Going to bed and discussing your deepest kinks and taboos and then exploring them together. Okay, Pluto, Venus. Those are the things and that can come up with the easier aspects, like the sextile or the trine, and or finding some nice clothes in the trash. Okay, Pluto with excretion, Venus, nice clothes. Or even, for example, your clothes are dirty because you've been working in the soil on your own land. Okay, Pluto, wealth, hidden wealth, Venus. So Pluto is kind of like the dirt and messing with that, and Venus is the clothes. So it's kind of like, hey, you're not clean, you're not pampered, you're not this, but it's like you've been working in the soil on your land, or you've been doing something that creates tremendous wealth or enjoying tremendous wealth. So that is the way that Venus-Pluto relations can come about. With the harder aspects, it means that the decomposing and finding the gold, okay, is in tension with a union. So you think, for example, you want to celebrate a kink with someone, but you have sexual trauma of like betrayal or rape, God forbid, or something like that, which unfortunately Mendaily Pluto can represent. But sometimes it's also facing your fears authentically, which is Pluto's in Saturn sign in general, but you know, in Saturn is fears, and facing your fears authentically and finding out the gold, versus, for example, knowing your worth. So think about first facing your fears authentically. It can be certain types or situations with Venus have to do with relationships and stuff. And the other thing is like knowing your worth. And when you have them, let's say at square, you'd have a situation of like a crisis where the fact that you know your worth is at odds with the decomposition experience of Pluto. So let's say, unfortunately, the first example that comes up is sexual violence, okay? And saying, for example, the fact that you know your worth, you know you're not to blame, you know you're not this, you know you're not that. And Pluto is like the decomposition where, let's say, you can have a fear of being traumatized, a fear of being hurt, and that can be that can bring about a situation where like you don't supposedly face your fears because you don't have the supportive union to do that, okay? And so that can bring in a situation where or the fact that you face your fears and you know your worth can bring about a certain crisis, and then the crisis can be internal or the crisis can be in general, okay? For example, you know your worth, and so in situations where other people would be from out of fear going to certain places that are compromising their sexual well-being, you know your worth and you require a different political Pluto, scientific Pluto, psychological Pluto, taboo and kink setting Pluto. For example, you know your worth, so those things no longer turn you on, okay? Because your erotic desire is no longer fear-based, and you have a more sensual or bodily, more somatic experience, and so you need to dissociate less. So you're not, that king doesn't speak to your heart anymore, okay? Or you know your worth and you don't go with certain political settings or power inequity, okay? Because it's like, hey, you know your worth. You know your worth, and you require certain things or certain material things, because Venus is also like possessions, to be there independently of the things that people would normally associate them with. Because a part of knowing your worth is like, hey, I'm worthy of a good night's sleep. I'm worthy of the time to take care of myself. I'm worthy of having the access to, whether it's take care of my body or my beauty or my garden, okay, to have nice clothes that are not like industrial based, but they're actually made by human beings rather than people that were dehumanized and degraded and enslaved. And so that is a situation where knowing your worth brings in a crisis, because now you stand 10 toes down, and now what has to transform is outside of you. And I think a lot about the Pluto Aquarius transits that we have is going to be about going from transforming from within to transforming what's outside, okay? and the awareness that something that we transform from within, yes, and the inner notion that that which is our surrounding needs to change is a point of attraction. Okay, it's a point of it's a gravitational point, very simply put, that's associated with our nervous system. And with Venus, knowing our worth is something that when it comes in a good aspect, because now is Venus closing a cycle with Pluto, when it comes in a good aspect, in a harmonious aspect, then that can be a magnet of abundance and magnet to what we desire and so on and so forth. And when Venus is in a hard aspect, and even a conjunction is a hard aspect, then Venus is transformed and decomposed. So that can be, for example, a situation where you face, like if I think about Pluto applying to square my Venus, then I work in my garden, and there are these, people that come from a different culture and have different notions and different expectations, and I have to transform them because I have to stand 10 toes down, and it's like I know my worth. I have to stand 10 toes down and remind them that, hey, what happened when we mistreated women? You lost land, okay? And Israel lost land as well. So you think about those crisis points where you have really undesired and disrespectful communication, and it's about transforming your environment and knowing your worth. It can't happen when I work in my garden, which is another, Venus thing, especially when there were like sex workers there, or you have one expectation and suddenly something completely else happens, and it's a complete crisis for all parties involved, okay? The ways of the old don't work anymore, and it's both the Venus that is transformed, or you actually meet who are the people who try to, enslave people, or why to do that. If I think about a situation of such giant transformation, when I was in academia, then one of the people I was TA to was trying to basically recruit me to human trafficking, that now I know is espionage. And that was a 10 toes down situation, because he probably didn't know if I'm espionage or not. I'm half Israeli, half Dutch. And I was working on my feminine facets. So I was on purpose, like dressing in more like things that were associated with feminine and stuff like that. And working out. So it was like he was meeting me at a time in my life where I was accentuating me as a woman. And those type of people that are espionage, that are spies, that are diddlers, they don't know if you're espionage or not. So he tries to very likely thinking he's crossing me over to his side or whatever it was. And me being transformed by the situation, because I don't understand the interaction. I was like, me thinking very naively, it's like, hey, if you're attracted to me, first of all, you're married, and second, if you are my boss, then we are in a structure where I cannot even consider you, because even if you weren't married, because, so see, I was thinking about like relational stuff, and that person coming from a perspective that was completely strange to me, and I would be along the years completely transformed when I would learn about espionage, when I would learn, because first it was like, what is human trafficking? And then I would learn that human trafficking is basically sexpionage, and it's all sex work is sexpionage, and all espionage is sexpionage. And I'm like, that's done to the men too, and all the things that I expose today. But you see how that crisis encounter, even in the harmonious aspects, because they had a Venus actually trining they had a Pluto actually trining my Venus, that maintained to the composite as well. And Pluto was trining my Venus. Like, I'm not joking. And indeed, now as the Pluto square, I had dealt with that person really malefically sexually assaulting me, and like the torture and like really weird stuff. So that's kind of like very fucked up. And the dumb fuckery of the MK Ultra came about because that was approaching 7th October. So he was a groomer. And I'm very glad I didn't go with him. But even the fact that I said no was not taken away for like the energy. And you can see that with Pluto, it's about decomposing something Whereas with my initial Venus would be like, hey, like, why do you try to put me in a situation where we have power inequity and there are implications to me saying no to you? And I was thinking about, well, it's intergenerational. He's not used to, you know, feminism and stuff like that. So I'm not going to, you know, be cruel to him, but I'm also not going to put myself in an uncomfortable position for me. And then there's the part of Venus being transformed and decomposed, where it's like, no, that's not even like the guy's MK Ultra, and he's trying to traffic you to do sexpionage and assassination because you have a dual passport. And no, that guy is not going to operate on a, like, you know, on the level that you think they're going to operate on, because they're fucking programmed, okay? And so that was pretty fucking scary. And it is a lot about how these two worlds also meet, because for him it was like meeting a person who is like not the cult, not the sexpionage, not anything they try to put on me, and it was like I wasn't fitting in any box. But then it became a crisis for him because he lost control. So it's kind of like really tragic when you think about this, because until you meet someone who's not at all in that type of, you know, boxes, you scare them away from you so much so that there was no interaction, okay? And I'm not talking about anything romantic. I was just like talking about the human encounter of like a person that is a spy that has to hide all of their life, even from themselves, and mostly dissociated and heavily drinking, and just like a human contact with another person that's not in the dumb fuckery is very challenging. And so I became aware of the challenges that people who are within those weird cults go through. And those are the cults that build our world, mind you. These are our politicians, our business people, our most inspiring, you know, professors and doctors. And now it's everyone, okay? It's your influencer on YouTube, it's your manicure, where you go to do your hair. And any person that has any touch to social engineering, basically, to different degrees and different levels. So the tension between Venus and Pluto is just about that. It's about knowing your worth. And when it's a hard aspect, this serves as a crisis point to the process of decomposition. And with Pluto, what meets Pluto needs to decompose. But Pluto is also transformed itself. The point about Pluto is this is the compost. It's constantly transforming. It's constantly disintegrating. It's constantly is the trash and the dirt, but also the nourishment and the gold and the things you find when you tend to that which is just long forgotten. It's not necessarily even taboo. You can think about it as the basement. Sometimes you put in the basement, you put your gold there as far as the things that you don't know where to put, okay? So those things are far easily tackled when you're willing to tend to them, and when knowing your worth is like, hey, I know what my worth. I'm not. Let's think about you dating someone and he's like, hey, come with me to the basement. And it's like, the fuck would I do that? Okay, I know my worth. I wouldn't come with you to the basement. And that square is a place where that Pluto wants to decompose something. You need to understand what's in that basement, and it's like, well, I can't get in there with you. You're like, well, there's gonna be we're gonna have to find another way to find out what's in that basement. And then you begin to ask girls, hey, have you seen that guy that asks people to come with them to the basement? It's like, then we are in a situation here, because the girls that went with him to the basement, we need some sort of forces, we need some sort of force, Pluto, that would put to light what's in there. So we need to invade, to break in, to find out what's in the basement. Now let's say there really is nothing in the basement, okay? But on the other hand, why would that person, okay, if like you're not going to be the one to find out. And you see how that squares, kind of like now you have to ask more women, have you run into that man that asked for girls? Has anybody been there? Has anybody knows what's in there? Can we break into that? So I think about the time where I was living in a house building, and I was changing kind of my clothes and putting all my clothes in the trash, next to the trash, so people can take what they like. And I see two men very excited take all the clothes that I put and bring it upstairs. And I'm like, I was so happy. I thought I was taking it for their girlfriends. And I was like, oh, somebody puts it to good use. And then I noticed that I never saw the women. One day, one evening, I drive with a taxi driver back home, and he tells me, there's a brothel here, right? And I'm like, what? He says, you don't know, every night there are 2-3 men that are going here. And mind you, they made no noise, but there's like and they go to this building in the middle of the night. And I was like realizing that these two men were traffickers, and I knew that I shouldn't call the police because the police will rape the women and share the dividends. So there was this issue that was never resolved. It's like, okay, what do you do about that? And then I began to look at, what is forums or what can be done. And I really, like, what I got from girls is kind of like, it just did not get a solution. Very simply put. There was no solution to that. And so you think about that as a crisis where, like, you know your worth. You're not going to get into that basement with that man. And at the same time, some people were in that basement. So that requires for, that already creates a crisis point. Okay? For example, the same man that was asking me if I live alone, and I said, like, the fact we asked that, he said, well, sometimes a woman is with children, and what will she do? That means that he is a trafficker. Okay, so when it comes to me, a girl that knows her worth, and it is not in a mother or something like that, is, understand a little bit about these things and understand that it never ends. It just never ends in a way that promises anything to anyone. But some other women could have. So I was shaking his hand, and we have a civil conversation, while this man was very likely a human trafficker. And it's not like a woman would come with him and she would have nice meals and compromise her body every once in a while, like you do in marriage. For until, like, the Venu Libra emancipation of marital sex. But that was marriage, okay, for many women. And so even if they were attracted to the guy in the beginning, okay, there's like people weren't actually talking about sex. And so there's the understanding that there are women there that need help. And they may be trafficked, they may be the children traded, maybe many things. And the decomposition of Pluto has a crisis point with the knowing your worth as Venus, because it's Venus kind of like, your worth, you're not going to go with that man. And at the same time, the fact that other people went with that man because they were already abused before that and never got to be exposed to knowing their worth is an impending doom on the entire country. Okay, and the entire neighborhood, and the entire society. And so you work your way through, and and if you think about when you're working a compost, okay, let's say you have a huge pile of compost, then you need to mix it, okay? But you work your way through to dig it in, put it upside down, upside down, upside down, until you get, you get to the rejuvenation. It's what's created there, so it's fertile enough to nourish something that is living. And when you think about the excavation part of Pluto, you think about the excavation, if you're working your way through those things, sort of what that problem is, okay? And all those things that you had to surrender at some time because you really did not have a way to deal with that. You're finding ways, like knowing your worth is also about tackling that problem, which is more than Venus. It's an intergenerational planet. Okay, so for a person that, let's say, is in human trafficking, it's kind of like it's knowing your worth, knowing that there are whichever way you can escape the situation and get the fuck out, and the fact that no, you won't have anybody that you can trust in this situation. And many people were not even exposed to that because they were either sold as children, they saw a dysfunctional house, and they never got to establish, especially not when they were raped as children, they never got to establish the fact that those ways of living are not even normal ways of living. And those things of Venus were never actually ingrained. And so there's the part of the people within which is like, hey, that's not a way that a woman is supposed to be treated, or a man is supposed to be treated, okay? Men are also in that. Or that's not a way, that's not a loving connection. Or the fact that somebody buys me stuff doesn't mean that he cares for me. Or all of those situations, that's like that's not a fair trade to compromise your well-being for whichever, whether it's a night's sleep or whatnot. And then, but from the outside, there is both this notion, okay, like women that were not at all in human trade, human trafficking, sex espionage, anything like that, kind of like not really getting, like they're in a different world, and even not really getting things about themselves that they do in their marriage, and they're like, well, yeah, I mean, like sometimes I sleep with my husband, I don't really want to sleep with my husband, I'm like, not always wet, so we put some gel, okay, and yeah, I mean those are things that happen. It doesn't mean that it's rape, or it's just like lack of awareness, okay? It's just like people develop, they travel, they do nice stuff together, and sometimes there is candida, so the husband or the boyfriend buys her something for the candida. That's a form of care, and it's like, okay, nobody really gets that there's something here because there's not the awareness. And so even the people outside, if you think about as within, so without, so even the people outside are not even awakening to that. And so the conversation about, let's say, sex workers has always been the right to their own body, and nobody even knew about the MK Ultra espionage. And even if people talk about childhood sexual trauma, but nobody had any idea that it's completely an industry of taking people, raping them on purpose, electrocuting them, causing dissociation on purpose, and then trading them for information that is anyway not complete picture, because the fragmented soul of a person cannot yield a whole picture, okay? That's how USSR felt, basically. But that is a part of the decomposition of Venus and Pluto, okay? If you think about an easy aspect, it's kind of like, you know, going from, oh, hey, let's learn tantric sex, and going to a workshop together, and then, you know, you learn about it, like, what are the symbols that you actually desire, and so on. And so a man learns, it's like, oh, I didn't have erectile dysfunction, I was just attuned to my girlfriend or to my partner, that wasn't ready or was thinking about something else, and it's just like it dropped, okay? Or for the other side, it's like, oh, I noticed that when we are like actually waiting and actually in deepening our tantric experience and so on, I don't have candida anymore. It's like, good morning. Okay? That can be an easy aspect. Okay, there's no crisis. You just came to a nice workshop and you wondered about that, and you're like, oh, that's that information again. When there is the crisis point, it's kind of like, hey, there's a human trafficking hub in my neighborhood. What do I do about this? Let's talk to some women. Well, they're prostitutes. Okay. And wondering, you know, for example, I'm half Dutch. I think it's, I don't know, the red light district is so ingrained in our culture that you go to Amsterdam is one of the things you go to see. Like, you go to see a museum, okay? It's like, and at COVID, people are talking about the red light districts not having that many red lights, okay? It is such a part of the culture. There's not even, I don't know how to explain that. And I had no idea that it's not only sex trafficking, but it's also sex espionage. Until very recently. And so you think about that as, my gosh, that's a crisis point, okay? That's the point where I would go to Netherlands. I was like, okay, perhaps the discourse about this topic is different than to Israel, or it's a different culture, or, you know, something like that. It was completely, totally gullible, totally naive, whereas learning that is transforming, or even for the Dutch people, that, like, people like, hey, that's the red light district. Like, who knows what happens there? And even when people talk about espionage, they think it's something erotic, and it's like, no, people are tortured. As a person that has been targeted by this MK Ultra, that basically everything has an episode of torture within it. God. And that's me, you know, standing 10 toes down. It's like, hey, I don't want that. That's not a healthy, happy, thriving, loving relationship. And it's also not good for, like, the information, the intelligence. You don't get the full picture. And that's like, well, they perpetuate the world war. So they have the inversion on everything, like medicine, like science, like economy, like sex, like upbringing, like everything. It's like, okay, that's got to go. Now, of course, that's a crisis, right? And so you can see how the fact that, you know, you kind of like, you know your worth, you just say no to something which is important, but there are things that are happening there for what about the people that weren't, okay, where you were? What about the people that weren't having that level of self-love that you have? What happens there, and what can be done about that? And so, hard aspects to Pluto. I mean, Pluto, the outer planets to inner planets, they're always going to be about something bigger than the self. And the hard aspects are like, there is a crisis of changing the power relations, exactly on when you talk about textile and human trafficking, when you talk about food, where you talk about human relations, when you talk about sexualities and kink and entertainment and sexualizing everything. I was listening to Anneke Lucas, and that means, I think, all of us in our kinky or taboo places, or even think we considered, you know, like, hey, that, I don't know, celebrating certain fantasy, or I'm a little, or I'm this, and it's like, putting that again into question and going even deeper. It's like, where did that kink come from? Not in the sense, not even in the sense of policing that kink, but definitely allowing things to decompose, as well as our entire society and programming and nervous system, whatever that entails.